Welcome and thanks for coming tonight. Tonight's a very different lecture than what we've been doing on Thursday Night Theology, as it's very contemporary and very artifact-oriented rather than textual or thought-oriented. So for this reason, it's far afield. I've put a lot of effort into making sense of this. I may not be able to answer questions at the end as I'm telling you what I know, and in some cases, all that can be known. But I've been collecting these articles since about June when I decided I want to do this topic. So things are somewhat current. I think the most recent article I found was from last week or so. So we are very on top of things tonight, I think. The war in Syria has been going on for about 3.5 years. And in that time, the crisis has displaced about 1,000 the crisis has killed about 1,000 people and displaced millions of them, or 100,000 people and displaced millions of them. Now let's go. In 2013, all of Syria's UNESCO sites were placed on the list of World Heritage in danger. You may ask, what's the concern over non-living objects when so many lives are being ruined? And that's a fair question. Now imagine if the U.S. was in a war here at home, and thousands are dying, but at the same time, the Lincoln Monument and the rest of the National Mall and all of the Smithsonian are under fire, or under attack. And yet somehow someone stole the Declaration of Independence. This would be major news and major concern for everybody here. These are objects that pull at our heartstrings, even if though they themselves are not living. And this is why often in movies, the climactic or traumatic event is the destruction of a building or an object. And that's exactly what's going on to the people in Syria and Iraq today. These architectural monuments are their treasures, and some of them are our treasures as well. Treasures belonging to the world, much like the pyramids in Egypt. Yet these treasures, despite being loved, are the direct and intentional victims of the current fighting. And they can become collateral damage from errant missiles, or sometimes they're simply destroyed from looting, people trying to make a buck in the otherwise hard times of the war. So this is a tour that we'll be taking tonight as we survey the recent destruction in Syria, Iraq, and the Islamic State. And we'll view material remains of several cultures spanning 5 millennia: the Mesopotamians, Assyrians, Babylonians, the Hellenistic Seleucids, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Islamic period, and modern period in construction as well. Unfortunately, just as this area has seen war before, it's also seen its cultural heritage looted and destroyed in the past. In the 19th century, imperial forces carried off what they could to Europe, and during the U.S. invasion in 2003, Baghdad's National Museum was looted, as were other sites across the country, as our military didn't always think to protect the local and really the many religious and cultural items that belong to our heritage. Right now, most of the losses occurring in northern Iraq and in the province of Nineveh, and in Syria as a result of Islamic extremists, anti-government rebels, and a reckless national militia or military. And these fighting populations seem to have little or no reverence for the antiquities, including stuff from the Roman period and Christian mosaics and the architecture all around them. So we'll look tonight at Syria's destruction first as a result of their prolonged civil war, and then we'll move on because the wake of ISIS, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and its path spans both eastern Syria and northern Iraq. ISIS is curious. As a group, they claim they want to recreate the caliphate, and so they seek to purge everything in society that doesn't conform with their extremist views, or extremist views of Islam. So while you may not be surprised that they would happily or quickly destroy pagan and Christian artifacts and material goods, which are not Muslim artifacts, they still are willing to destroy Islamic holy sites. In particular, they're willing to destroy Shiite Muslim holy sites, but as we'll see, even stuff that is sacred to Sunni Muslims, which Islamic State supposedly is, they're willing to destroy these things as well because they perceive them to be idolatrous in nature. In theory, ISIS demands that museums, libraries, and their contents, archaeological sites, shrines, tombs, and even mosques need to be destroyed because of their idolatrous nature. And currently, with red representing the land that is now claimed to be the Islamic State, currently at least 4,000 archaeological sites are located within ISIS-controlled areas, meaning that they have been or are soon to be targets of attackers and or looters. The map here, it looks like a huge area, and I'm not denying the geography of this place, but keep in mind most of this red area is desert. So when you come down to it, this yellow map here, or this yellow on the map here, is really more representative of what's actually controlled, because this is where the people actually are. But anyway, what we'll do tonight, we'll start out in Syria, or what was Syria as of 3 years ago. I don't know what the technical consideration of that state is tonight. We'll start in Syria here at Mari, and then we'll move up towards Dura Europos, to Raqqa, to Aleppo, and to Idlib and Apamea, and then finally we'll head down to Home and Damascus, and then Palmyra. Then we'll look at Iraq. Most of our interest will be in Mosul, to the north, also in Kalak and Hatra, near there, a little bit to the south and west, then to Tikrit, finally Samarra on the way down, before we won't actually be making it to Baghdad tonight. So that's the planned route. So here we are in Syria, a little bit more detailed of a map. According to Zahid Tajadin of Syria, he says, Syria is like an open-air museum. There are on record more than 10,000 archaeological sites in Syria, he says. And so of Syria's 6 UNESCO sites, or World Heritage places, all of them have been damaged by gunfire, rockets, and mortars in the past 3 years. For example, in Apamea, which is around here, in 2012, rebels took over the Al-Mahdik castle near Apamea in the northwest with its Greco-Roman architecture. It's high ground, so it's a strategic location, but the government bombed it to get the rebels, and it became the battle line for several days in March 2012, with tanks positioned all around. As soon as the Syrian army took the citadel, it bulldozed many roads nearby to make it even more accessible there on the citadel's hill. After all this, Al-Mahdik Castle became vulnerable to looters, and the archaeologists aren't really sure what artifacts it might have contained and what was to be found in the castle. And so now, with the destruction and the looting, all this potential information is all the more lost. Satellite images show holes dug all over the site, and according to sources on the ground, some 30 mosaics, here a representative of the kind of mosaic at the site, some 30 mosaics like this were stolen in the past 2 years. According to Emma Cunliffe, who is a heritage consultant specializing in Syria, she says, it has taken them 4 or 5 months to strip Apamea. There are lots of looters with earth-moving machines. So this is not just mom-and-pop locals with their trowels. This can be huge-scale digging. In Mari, which is near the Iraqi border, the city of Mari was already a major regional player in the earliest periods of recorded human history, almost contemporary with the Great Pyramids of Egypt. We have records about diplomatic missions, sacrificed offerings, and wars at Mari dating back to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. In the 18th century BC, Zimri Lim of Mari, who was a contemporary and one-time ally of Hammurabi the Great of Babylon, he built his palace here. And so you see in 2012 his palace, and then earlier this year, 2014. Now we have tens of thousands of tablets from this palace and other nearby archives, letters to and from diplomats and enemies, offering records, records of women in the royal harem or the woman's house, prophetic oracles, proverbs, discussions on the difference between the Benjaminites, who are a tribal people outside of town, and how they're different from the urbanite Mari people. Hammurabi eventually destroyed Zimri Lim's palace in the 18th century, but this area was discovered in 1933 by French explorers and archaeologists, and it's been under excavation until relatively recently, the past decade. This site has been invaluable, and this cannot be stressed. It's been invaluable for helping us understand this period, the 18th century of ancient Mesopotamia, as this is our major source. This is a period of the rise of Babylon and Hammurabi, and it gives us incredible insight into Western Semitic peoples, including the ancestors of our biblical peoples, but it also, here as you see in our sites, is now vulnerable to looters. And if you can tell, and I think you can actually see better than I can on my computer, these holes that dot the area, those are the holes left behind by looters digging up. And so it's very clear even from these satellite high-resolution images. Moving into our spiral into Syria is Dura Europos. It's a classical period site occupied from the 3rd century BC until the 3rd century AD, and it's near still the Iraqi border. It was founded by Alexander the Great's successor, and it was later controlled by the Romans and various Persians, and now it is under ISIS control. Before ISIS came about, or before Syria's revolution started in 2011, researchers and archaeologists discovered evidence of chemical warfare in 2009 that actually dated back to the 2nd century of our era. Apparently, Persians dug under the city walls and set fires with poisoned sulfurous gas to then gas the Romans that occupied the city. So it's always been contentious. This site has always been difficult, and now it's being vulnerable to looters. Other discoveries here include pagan temples, one of the world's largest churches, one of the earliest churches or the oldest examples of the Christian church house, and some of our oldest preserved synagogues, including the one that this piece of work was taken, a synagogue that dates back to 244 BC, as indicated by an inscription there, and this synagogue was discovered in 1932. This picture you might recognize. It was just in the news last month once this came under ISIS control. Now that it is under ISIS control, we have no idea what the status of this ancient or most ancient synagogue is. And note that like Mari, you can see all sorts of holes in this 150-acre area that's now polluted with pits. According to reporters, hundreds of people will be there all day digging up, some with guns and some with gangs, and as soon as an artifact is discovered, it is sold or transitioned over and headed out to the black market. So scholars and archaeologists have no idea what's being discovered, and this can never be used for learning. Moving on to Aleppo, which is Syria's largest city and perhaps one of, or if not the longest, oldest still occupied cities in the world. Aleppo's in northwest Syria. It's as ancient as Mari, and was a major power player in the area in the 3rd millennium and 2nd millennium BC. And archaeological evidence suggests it goes back thousands upon thousands years further. Recent destruction in this famous city includes archaeological sites and artifacts that date back to the 2nd millennium, a Hittite temple, and the destruction of Islamic mosques and a Crusader castle, or Crusader buildings and shrines, all from the 2nd millennium of our period. Aleppo's souks, or open marketplaces, they date back here to the 13th century, at least as far as infrastructure and building goes. The souk tradition itself goes back beyond history, I'd imagine. But this souk in Aleppo consists of more than 7 miles of alleyways that wind throughout, making it one of the major tourist attractions of the city, and perhaps also the heart of commerce in the city. This is where you go to buy your groceries, your spices, your dry goods, your clothing, metals, whatever else you need. It'll be there to be bartered for. However, the Free Syrian Army rebels established a headquarters in a bathhouse nearby, so the souk became a target a couple years ago. And in the shelling, an electricity substation caught fire, so that much of the souk went down in flames. Thousands of shops were totally destroyed, leaving thousands of shop owners with nothing. And so here you see the vibrant picture, and there you see what's left over after the fire. And there is actually video if you go online. There's some sites I'll show you. There's actually video of the burning and the destruction. So for good or bad, you can take a look at this yourself. We have also Aleppo's Great Mosque, or the Great Umayyad Mosque. It's located near the souk, and tradition holds that John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, his remains are there in this mosque. So it's holy to Christians and Muslims alike. The mosque itself dates back to the 8th century, with the current version here being built sometime between the 11th and the 14th century. And it's considered by several to be one of the most important monuments of medieval Syria. And the minaret there is about 50 meters tall, was built in 1095. Before this area was a mosque, it served as a garden for the Cathedral of St. Helena, which is Constantine's mother, church named after her in the 6th century. However, in March of last year, 2013, the minaret of the Great Umayyad Mosque was destroyed. It had served as a sniper position and a lookout for the rebels, so this place was a natural and almost necessary target in the eyes of the government. And so the minaret collapsed from shelling. So imagine this, the equivalent of our losing the Twin Towers in New York if the Twin Towers were 1,000 years old. And here's more destruction of the mosque outside and then inside as well. And here a little bit you can see this hallway on your right. There were thousands of Islamic and Arabic manuscripts housed in the Great Mosque, so many of them would have been destroyed in the meantime as well. The Syrian Association for Preserving Heritage and Ancient Landmarks was founded in Aleppo in 2013. Its members, many archaeology students from Aleppo University, took at considerable risk to themselves. They saved the stones from the minaret with the hope that they can restore it, or at least partially restore it one day and reconstruct it after the war. This picture here is an individual. He's standing in front of the 13th century Hawali Madrasa, which is a prayer niche in the mosque. So he's building up the wall to protect it, to hide it away from the world. Similarly, we see here two individuals building up a brick wall in front of Zechariah's tomb, giving it so that it's no longer or not potentially in the front lines of the battles. Since now you know that Zechariah is here traditionally buried in Aleppo, John the Baptist traditionally is buried in Damascus. So here are people preventing what the war will cause later on. Here we have, this was caused by aerial bombing at the Al-Mektebat building in the Al-Nasser district. The citadel, or the hill in Aleppo, has been a strategic location since the 3rd millennium. The most recent round of reconstruction was from the mid-19th century after it was damaged by an earthquake. But previous reconstructions date back to the 15th century under the Mamluks, and in Crusader times from Saladin's son al-Zahir al-Ghazi, and other moments of reconstruction in the 10th and 4th centuries AD. Tradition holds that the citadel was first fortified by Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals, in the 4th century BC. Right now, or at least a few months ago, it's being used by the Syrian army, or the al-Assad regime, as a lookout spot and a sniper point. So it's going to draw fire, and it's causing fire. And you see here we have automatic weapons going through the citadel tops to attack the rebels. This is published by Aleppo Syrian Television. Within the citadel, we have the Hittite temple, which dates back to the 2nd millennium. This temple was excavated in 1997 by a German team of archaeologists. The temple is dedicated, or was dedicated, to the Hittite weather god known as Teshub or Tarhunza or Hadad or Baal, whatever. There were multiple various ancient languages that called this deity by various names. The one you may be most familiar is the Semitic Baal. So here we see the protective roofs that they'd built falling down, and we see also, if you see the arrow here, it's looking at some reliefs, and you can see, zoom in here of what's hiding underneath the arrow. That would be here in the destruction. So you see these ancient reliefs dating back, I guess, to about the 13th century, or destroyed underneath this temple. This temple would have been active from the 24th to the 9th centuries BC, so about 1,500 years, and that was 3,000 years ago. Tradition also has that Abraham would milk his sheep on the citadel site in Aleppo. So tradition is not just ancient and pagan, it's very much Christian, Jewish, and Muslim as well. And here we have a 4th century mosque, Al-Hadadin, where the roof is collapsing. And then here we have the Al-Tarush Mosque, which was built in 1408. If you follow the arrows, you see the dome, its crack, and then from underneath the dome, you see how these cracks are realized from the shelling. And with this dome in particular, archaeologists and structuralists are not sure how long this will survive if the dome is not stabilized, or if it's not been stabilized yet. Here, just another dome from the 13th century. The sepulchre of the Umayyad Caliph Suleiman bin Abd al-Malik, he was the Caliph from 674 to 717, so a very ancient man, and one of the first caliphs. So ISIS state of Iraq and Syria should revere because they want to bring back the caliphate. But here you see even his tomb is vulnerable to ISIS whims and fancies. And not only that, he was caliph for the last 2 years, so 715 to 717, and his uncle had been the previous caliph, so he was from a very important line. But despite this, his tomb, this picture of destruction was from August.
So were those descendants of Muhammad?
No, in Sunni tradition, the caliph is the spiritual heir, not the blood heir, and so in that sense, their descent from Muhammad as Muslim leaders, in the same way that ISIS purports to be, but yet they are not interested in this, perhaps because there's so much respect for the individual that they fear it would be an idolatrous moment. Here we have more destruction at the Sufi Maqam or Mausoleum al-Nabi Daud. This was destroyed by ISIS with a bulldozer on August 18th. And then I believe this one was, these pictures are from September 30th, so just 3 weeks ago. Nothing major damage as far as the building itself goes. You see in the circle where shells have hit it, you see where the front doors have been torn open. But if you go inside, and this isn't necessarily from last month, you see artifacts are just absent. And so that's the archaeological museum in Aleppo. And finally, here, this mosque and madrasa are totally destroyed in the second picture. And this was built in 1544. Moving away from Aleppo, more to the northeast, near the coast, in Al-Bara, Idlib, we see the destruction of Byzantine tombs. And this area is also famous for many mosaics, which archaeologists were very afraid that these mosaics, like these tombs, would be major victims of attack, by direct attack, by ISIS. And then we have here the dead city of Sanshara, which again is in the Idlib province. This picture, I believe, is from 2011 in June. Oh, yes, it is. It's part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And here we see Syrian aircraft dropping bombs to dislodge refugees from the Byzantine period dead city of Sanshara. So here they're destroying the place to get the people out.
From the refugees? They want the refugees out, or the rebels?
The rebels, or whomever that they might fear to be rebels. Here, this is 2010 in Home. We have the Croc de Xavier, forgive my French, which is considered one of the world's largest and best preserved, or as of 2010, largest and best preserved Crusader castles. And experts consider this a great example of medieval European engineering and fortification building, with a cross-channel of Islamic influence as well. Its strategic location, however, it's guarding the only corridor from Syria's interior to the coast, as well as to the entrance of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. And so, because of this location, it was guaranteed that there would be fierce battle over it, just as there was fierce battle in the time of the Crusaders when they were here building this castle, or this church. So here's a photo in 2010. Here we see it from this year, which, according to the article I found, was described as moderate structural damage. Since the war began, photographers have revealed 3 new military compounds built in and around this park area, with 2 of them actually within the boundaries of the park for the Croc de Xavier. According to Brian Daniels, who's Director of Research and Programs at the Penn Culture Heritage Center at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, from our contacts and sources in Syria, he says, we knew that there was damage to World Heritage sites, but this report surprised us by revealing just how extensive the destruction actually is. And so here is the building being bombed 6 months ago. Moving on from Aleppo to Damascus, here we have Damascus is Syria's second largest city. It was settled already in the 7th millennium BC, if not earlier. The city has a long and glorious past, including its designation as Aram Damascus in your biblical narratives in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. Most of the citadel's 12 towers date to the 12th century, where it served as the headquarters and chief arsenal for the great Saladin as he fought against the Crusaders. And it was used as a prison as recently as 1985. But here we see on the western face of the outside wall near the throne room, after it was hit by a shell, leaving nearly a meter or a yard-wide hole in the building. Here we have it's a close-up, so I don't have the full picture of the mosque for you, but the Great Mosque in Damascus. Here we have some of its mosaics, which were fired on by rebels from who were hiding in the suburbs northeast of Damascus. Here we see the destruction of the mosaics on the facade of an 8th century building, or 8th century mosque. The mosaics depict visions of paradise with great buildings surrounding by trees and gardens. Or at least it once did, and according to reports, it now does, as this mosaic has been restored to some degree. I have not seen a recent picture. 40 miles northeast of Damascus, near the Lebanese border, is the city of Ma'alul. My Arabic is horrible, worse than my French. Ma'alullah, where the Syrian government's latest victories in this area were. The town is acclaimed because it's one of the few places that still speaks and teaches Aramaic, Jesus' language. So it's very rare in this way. However, most of the 2,000 residents of this town left a couple years ago, and you may have seen reports that 13 nuns had been kidnapped last year by Islamic rebels. These nuns have since been freed. However, several of the churches in Ma'alullah have been intentionally damaged by the rebels, as you see here, with crosses torn down and statues of Jesus and Mary intentionally destroyed. Our final stop inside Syria tonight is Palmyra. This is considered one of the most important religious Middle Eastern buildings of its time, which is to say the early Imperial Roman period. This is about 2,000 years old, and architecture-wise there's a synthesis of Roman, Greek, Persian, and Babylonian architecture. And apparently, those of you who are into 18th century England, this motif of the stylistic rose and leaf pattern was very popular as a revival in 18th century England. So its influence may be recognizable to you today. After the bombardment, the Temple of Baal, which is seen here, one with paramilitary, and then two, you see after attacks, we see now that this Temple of Baal has been used as a military site. And other sites around it have been as well. There are several pictures of tanks making sure that this place is accessible for the military. And you can see on these two pictures several points of damage. A hole in the southern wall of the temple, 1 by 2 meters, and a hole in the eastern side of the temple, 1.5 by 1.5 meters. Several of the columns in the south have been hit, and 2 of them collapsed. The southern wall was hit by bullets and shells in several places. The western wall was hit on the inside and the outside. The northern wall was struck by 2 limited hits, and the eastern wall of the temple endured several holes. And then lots of burning as well, as you can see. So even though the regime has tried to stake this out, or perhaps because the regime has tried to stake this out, it has been a moment of war over the course of the past couple of years. And of course, now that it's getting all this attention, people are there to loot it. If you'll see here are 2 of the 9 statues that were actually recovered. People trying to take these out of the country to Lebanon and anywhere else they can to get them onto the black market. These statues date back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries A.D. They are made of limestone and placed inside the tombs. So because of the potential of statues in tombs, all sorts of grave robbing is being attempted at the Temple of Baal. And with some of these will have inscriptions, as you can see, indicating the deceased's name, age, lineage, and what job they had in life. One last stop, now that I remember. This was taken in May. This is in Raqqa, which is more to the north outside of the spiral we've been following. This is an 8th century BC Assyrian statue taken from Tel Ajaja on the Kabor River, which is in Raqqa, near ISIS's headquarters there in Syria. And you can just see they're celebrating the destruction of this statue that, again, is 2,800 years old. While Iraq has benefited from the UN resolution banning the trade of antiquities from Iraq after the 2003 war, Syria is not covered by this protection. So black market is very available and ready and willing to take any of these objects. According to Candida Moss, professor of New Testament at Notre Dame, this region has been the center of the world for every great empire recorded in human history. We are talking about successive generations of history all in one place, all being destroyed at the same time. And so now we'll move to Iraq, which is also where all of history is being all destroyed all at the same time. We'll go north to south from Mosul down to Tikrit. In June 16, ISIS burned several churches in Mosul and raped 5 women in the city just to demonstrate the power that they had. This was less than a week after Prime Minister al-Maliki declared there was a state of high alert. So here ISIS was intentionally showing off. Mosul is in the middle of 1,791 registered archaeological sites, with 250 buildings and 4 ancient Assyrian capitals. So this area is full of archaeology and ancient history. According to an individual quoted, the Iraqi army will be obligated to conduct operations next to these archaeological sites in battle with ISIS, and it will destroy them and say the Iraqi Iraqi government or regime will inadvertently shoot at and destroy these sites, and then ISIS will use this to say that the state is destroying the sites. So it's not just that ISIS is trying to destroy, they're trying to undermine other authority at the same time. So the idea is, from ISIS's point of view, this will become a cultural, not just a physical desert. In June 29 this year, ISIS had destroyed or removed old statues and shrines from Mosul because they bared signs of idolatry or polytheism. And they also razed the so-called Tomb of the Girl, or Kabar al-Bint, which according to legend belonged to a girl so beautiful, but who died of a broken heart. It probably actually belonged to a 12th and 13th century historian named Ali ibn al-Ithir, who was someone who traveled with Saladin in Syria and who wrote about the Crusades and the Mongol invasions. Recent reports claim that the tombstone, so here in the pre-destruction moment, and then there somewhere later, the tombstone in the shrine was a modern replica, and the original is safe in a museum. But the building itself is very gone. Curiously, Ibn al-Ithir was a Sunni, and so this shows again that ISIS is not just destroying Christian or Shiite materials, but even their fellow Sunni materials. It's more than just theology, it's more than just religion, it's politics. They're trying to show what they will do if people don't listen to them. These are threats as much as they are religious demonstrations. There had been reports that there were statues that were being destroyed in Mosul about this time. These reports tended not to be true, although most of the destruction, other than the tomb of the girl, had been limited to Shiite shrines, most of which had been built in the past decade. So that's what was going on in the end of June. Also in June, at the museum, the second largest museum in Iraq, it was occupied by ISIS, and the staff was not allowed to enter to check on the collections. This is a museum that after the 2003 invasion had just gotten ready, having recollected everything, to open their doors for a viewing public. So it had just been restored as of mid-July. So it might be that things are safe, as reports of ISIS destroying statues seem to be exaggerated, but we just don't know. The reports were that ISIS was planning to put statues on trial and find them guilty because they were false idols and caused people to worship Allah incorrectly as pictorial evidence. And quickly this information spread that they were destroying the idols. But any picture you see of ISIS destroying idols, that's all out of Syria, like I showed earlier, and nothing actually, at least as of recently, is out of Iraq. Several believe that these displays were meant to keep the people of Mosul in fear, as opposed to happening out of pure religious fervor. So we just don't know. Here we have Mosul is a city of about 1.5 million people, the second largest city in what we would have called Iraq. And they blew up Jonah's tomb in Mosul, which, as Jonah is from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, is mentioned by Jesus in the Gospels and is mentioned in about a dozen verses in the Quran. Jonah is revered by all three Abrahamic religions. So this was an intentional destruction of the ancient building. The shrines of the prophets to Daniel and to the Muslim prophet Seth and Jarjes have also been destroyed, but the tomb of Jonah and its destruction were the most traumatic for the people. One person, a 32-year-old unemployed man who lives near the site, Abdullah Malik Mustafa, we were crying when they detonated it. We couldn't believe that the history of Mosul had disappeared. I wanted to die, he said. Jonah's tomb had never been properly studied. We know it had a medieval core. The minaret, though, had been built in 1924. It also sat on the high grounds of a mound or a tell that belonged to a Christian church and also an Assyrian temple and palace. And word is that you could actually see the winged bulls underneath the mound Some of it had been visible as of 1990. So this was a very ancient location of reverence and a very ancient site. It is reported when the militants arrived, local people stood in ISIS's way, and the women in the neighborhood went and slept there, according to reports, and told them, "If you want to blow it up, we're going to go with it." So I'm not sure what that means for a casualty count, or if they came back at another time, but this is the kind of devotion that this particular shrine had to its locals. Here we have, this is a picture from the British Museum. So this item here is totally safe, but Kalach, or Nimrud, which is the location of Assur-Natsir-Pal's palace from the early 9th century, Kalach is now under ISIS control. And according to one source, and this is representative of some of the reliefs that are still in the palace, they are cutting these reliefs into small parts and selling them. They don't need to excavate because they've already been found. They just need a chainsaw to cut the heads or the legs if they want. So here, whatever is still there in Kalach is very vulnerable to looters and destruction. Moving on to Hatra, which is more to the west. If nothing else, those of you who like to watch scary movies know this building, as apparently this is the temple from The Exorcist. And it fell into the hands of ISIS in June 25 of this year, meaning that the statues that are inside may be vulnerable if ISIS does get around to destroying or putting statues on trial. We have no evidence that they've done that yet, but they always could. In June, Iraqi police guarded the temple from looters after ISIS first arrived, and Iraqi warplanes have dropped bombs within a mile of this temple. This is a pre-Christian temple dedicated to the sun god Shamash, as built sometime in the 3rd century BC during the Seleucid Empire. And it was actually one of the few monuments that was intentionally guarded by the U.S. troops in 2003 during the U.S.-led invasion. It was intentionally guarded because some of the soldiers saw it from their hotel and recognized it from the movie. And therefore they knew it was important and needed to be protected. So I've not seen this movie. I'm almost curious to at least find this scene just to see how this can inspire a heroic deed. Prior to the invasion and after the movie, Saddam Hussein had felt that this site was important enough to protect, so he had actually closed it off to outsiders. So there is a long history of concern over this temple to Shamash in Hatra. Speaking of Saddam, with so many shrines being destroyed, I learned that his relatives decided to move his body from its burial place in Awija, which is a village near Tikrit, and they've moved it to an undisclosed location. According to his cousin, relatives worried that the grave had become something of a shrine for Saddam Hussein's sympathizers and would therefore be a target for airstrikes or by the government or Shiite militias in the area. Last month, ISIS blew up an early Christian site in Tikrit known as the Green Church, or Al-Kanessa al-Qadra. According to Ibram al-Nasari, who spoke last January before this destruction, during the Roman period, he said, Tikrit witnessed the construction of 12 churches, among which were 4 of the most famous in the city. The Green Church was the largest and most beautiful in Tikrit. It was built in an agricultural area and used to be like a big cathedral that drew great attention. The Green Church, speaking now, is in ruins. It used to be the biggest church in Tikrit, the capital of the East for Christianity and Jacobites. It served, like today's Vatican, as the see of the church, of the East and the headquarters of the Orthodox Church. So here is what it looked like before. I didn't have any destruction photos. Moving on, again, last month into Crete, Saladin's capital, or his castle. Again, Saladin fought the Crusaders. And here you see the bombing itself, the fallout, the ash cloud after it was attacked. And here we have an 11th century mosque. The shrine in this mosque housed 40 martyrs who had made to Crete a major city in the 7th century as Islam first expanded. Thousands of people used to visit this shrine annually, and we found inscriptions dating this as a school or a madrasa to the 13th century. So for this reason, this one seems to have been intentionally destroyed. And then we have, moving on to Samarra, our last major stop today. Samarra was the second capital of the Abbasid Caliphate after Baghdad. Following the loss of the monuments in Baghdad, Samarra represents the only physical trace of the Caliphate at its height. The city preserves 2 mosques and many unusual minarets, as we'll see in a moment, as well as some of the largest palaces in the Islamic world. Here we see this building was attacked first in 2006 by the Sunni insurgents as an attempt to make the Shiite population retaliate. And there were chants in 2006, angry chants of retaliation yelling, "Our blood and our souls we sacrifice for you imams." 2 of the 12 holiest imams were buried here, so this was a very holy Shiite location. The idea being, if then the insurgents blew it up, there'd just be a spiral of violence between the Shiites, or even Iran coming in. And so when ISIS came in this year to attack it again, this hope of spiraling lack of control was part of the motivation behind this destruction. As far as I know, this minaret here, this tower, is still fine and doing well, and I think it's a beautiful building, so I hope it stays protected. I just have no idea. This one, I don't have a year for this 9th century building. The mosque and its spiral minaret are among some of the most important and famous architecture sites in Samarra. And curiously enough, I learned that lusterware as a relief motif was based out of the architectural patterns here at Samarra rather than on gold and silver. So a variation on that theme for utensils and the like was also found from this area. So that's what I've found. That's what I'm able to report on tonight. If you want to do more in-depth or more site-specific, you heard me mention UNESCO. I never actually defined it. It's the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And so any building or intellectual and historic property that's been designated as UNESCO will have this symbol on it to let you know that you are looking at a world site. And they have descriptions, not up-to-date destruction descriptions, but they have descriptions of many of these locations that we talked about tonight. Also, and this is really a fascinating thing that I only learned about after I put all my slides together, ASOR, the American School of Oriental Research, their Syrian Heritage Initiative, they do a weekly report of what has happened to the monuments and architecture and archaeology in Syria. So you can go to their website and download a weekly PDF if you are curious of more things there. And then another place, you recognize the red circles and this little temple or idol head. This is an Assyrian group that was founded in, or a Syrian group that was founded in 2011 as to document and report on destruction in Syria. So they have lots of video, lots of photography as well, and descriptions. Naturally, it's in Arabic. You can translate it into English. Half of it seems to come out as French, so it may be a little bit odd to use as a text, but the pictures are there. You can figure out what's being described. And then finally, this in September 24th, the PBS NewsHour had a 7-minute segment protecting ancient treasures from becoming casualties in Iraq and Syria. They did a 7-minute clip where you saw the destruction of Jonah's tomb, that explosion. I pulled that picture from their footage. So they have an introduction to what's going on as well. So that's what I can tell you. There was a lot to research, and in this case, I have to say, unfortunately. So I'll try, if there are any questions, I'll try to answer, but I've really given you everything that I know. So maybe clarifications. Or
I have a question for Leon. Was that like a rebar in some of the structures? So rebar's been around that long?
It was a facade on a building that was built within the last several centuries, probably outside. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Great Mosque in Damascus, there's rebar coming out, indicating recent work on the building prior to this destruction. Thank you.
Hagia Sophia in Istanbul has rebar in it, and it was built in the 7th century AD. And so iron was early recognized as a reinforcing material for the magic material of concrete that the Romans used.
I was just, had no idea that. I thought of it as fairly recent.
Any other questions or comments?
Do you think any of these people who are deliberately destroying will ever rue the fact that they have destroyed some of their own heritage?
Do I think that they'll rue the fact that they're destroying some of their own heritage? I would probably think like the Al-Assad regime, those individuals who have to fight for the government and are finding themselves in this situation, I would imagine they will look back and lament having to be a part of this just in general. I don't think it's necessarily their choice to be fighting. So I'm sure that group will lament what's going on, what's being destroyed in material culture ways. The members of ISIS or the Islamic State, they are very deliberately and seemingly happily.
It just struck me like a bunch of rowdy teenagers destroying for the joy of destruction.
Destroying for the sake of destruction is a lot of what they're doing. Right. And I don't think they'll be apologetic about it. They won't look back in 10 years and say, oh.
So if you got two statues, and you put them both on trial, how can you make a judgment one would be an idolatrous statue and one is not? What's the criteria that you think they may be using for this judgment?
The criteria of how to find one statue guilty or one statue not guilty. I don't know that there would be any actual criterion. I think it'd be, this is for show.
Yeah,
So just like we have the idea of the rabbis putting God on trial during the Holocaust. What are you going to do if you find him guilty? So yeah, it's for the display, for the rhetoric, to catch people's attention. In Judaism, thousands of years ago, the rabbis decided that mosaics. Do I have a mosaic anywhere?
One from a synagogue.
Is that a mosaic?
Oh.
I think that's a painting.
Okay, sorry.
I'll find one some.
Yeah, you might have. Rebar one.
Oh, right.
That was-
Here's one.
yeah.
So, if you go to Israel today, there are synagogues with mosaics of Greek gods. Like there's a zodiac in one, an Apollo driving a chariot. And so this idea is, why would a very monotheistic people be celebrating and using all this very pagan or polytheistic artwork? And one, they were just using what was contemporary, so they were making use of what they liked. But for the rabbis, they knew, or at least they explain, if a statue or an idol has been chipped or damaged, no pagan is going to worship that. So it's useless. And a mosaic is nothing but chipped and damaged things put together. So the Jews had no concern of worry that people would worship a broken statue or a broken up mosaic. That kind of tolerance doesn't seem to be on ISIS's mind. It's just a statue is a statue regardless. So yeah, I don't think anything would be acquitted in their trial.
Has this attitude of destruction been around for thousands of years? Would you compare and contrast what ISIS is doing to what is written in the book of Joshua?
Well, I think as far as comparing ISIS to Joshua, I think the idea is the same there. You destroy whatever culture you find because it's a distraction from the culture you're trying to implement or the society that you're trying to implement. And so Islam has that as a bad part of their history. Christianity has that as a bad part of their history. And they look to the Old Testament, they look to Joshua and say, here it declares war on the locals. It's okay, it's sanctioned by God, as though it's an acceptable model. So I think that is something that ISIS can pull out and say, look, your people did it. We're just the newer iteration of this.
Did similar destruction happen during the Crusades?
I'm sure that there was destruction in the Crusades. Every war just naturally brings all sorts of collateral damage to buildings. And I'm sure more of you know than I could guess how much collateral damage was done in Europe 70 years ago with the bombings of those cities in World War II. That's just how it works. When the Assyrians were overrun by the Babylonians and Persians and Medes in the 7th century, the Persians came in. They had people trained to attack certain pieces of art, which they would gouge out the pictures of the king, not the pictures of the slaves in the reliefs. So it's just, that's 2,700 years ago. That's just the way fighting seems to work, and still is today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.